You're really not remedying this?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, good evening once again, everyone. We had some technical difficulties and we are back to resume our meeting. So I'll make a motion to resume the meeting.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. When last we were here, we were waiting for Marie to get on and we were waiting for Ted, who had prior meetings, and I screwed up the schedule on that. Apologies. But I guess fate saw us to the same point. So here we are. Asked Ted here tonight. There were a number of questions asked on the proposed PMU2, which Ted had sent answers to. And so I think maybe he could further explain things tonight. The advantages of the other option was the MU1, which Marie had proposed and added guardrails, so-called guardrails to. So I think we should discuss both. But Ted, maybe you could walk us through or make it a little clearer on the PMU1 and how you feel that's either, you know, if it is better or not, or where do you see the advantages of that and what the process would be, or how much it would add to a process versus like a MU1.
Yes, okay. So I didn't have the advantage of being involved in the whole development of the MU1 district. But as I understood it, as I became involved in helping the village board with a seeker review process for all of the different code update chapters, one thing that did come up was the MU1 district, and as I understood it, there was some additional measure of control that I believe the village board wanted to see for an overall development of the MU1 district, being that it's the largest district remaining in the village, and especially for the Marathon site where there were issues related to public health because of the remediation of that site and the possible presence of an additional plume there. There seemed to be, an importance to having an overall development scheme for that property that retains some measure of authority from the village board. And so at first we talked about the possibility of having perhaps a floating district, something like a planned unit development. And then I thought about it, and I've been involved in situations where there was village board approval, not for a zoning change, which can get very lengthy, it can get very contentious, it can also be very complicated because there's so many different steps involved in making a zoning change. That I thought that maybe a middle ground would be to have the village involved in the review of an overall plan for the MU1 district, but not in a zoning amendment sort of a process, but one that would retain village board authority for special use permits. And many municipalities do retain certain authority for some special permit uses. It does address the whole use question, which the village board is ultimately responsible for as the caretakers of the zoning within the village, which essentially is a regulation on use and density of use. And so it does give the village board the opportunity to be able to have a say in making sure that whatever development is proposed on a site like Marathon, that it bears a strong relationship with the village comprehensive plan, which had specific recommendations for Marathon, that'll be a mixed use area, that it include residential uses, office, retail, open space, work live units, and that sort of thing. And so the village board has the authority under New York State village law to delegate the responsibility for special use permits to an administrative board, but it can also retain that authority. And so in discussions that we had over the last few weeks, one of the things that came out was that a special use permit may be a sort of a middle ground that would retain village board authority for issuing a special use permit that would revolve around a more conceptual plan of development, in much the same way that the village board, if they're handling subdivision applications, generally go through a sketch plan, preliminary plan, and then a final plan subject to approval. So it's much more conceptual. It involves the mix of uses, the types of information that would be included in a conceptual plan that would be part of a special use permit, may include things like an examination of traffic and the sufficiency of the street network and intersections within the village to be able to handle development that would be proposed on that property. And because of the limitations that exist within this area of the village, the streets are rather limited in their capacity. There's been discussions for years now about having additional access to that area of the village so that there weren't adverse impacts on the village's street network. So the conceptual plan seemed to be one of the paths forward. And so other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of additional discussion other than, okay, well, let's see what sort of things that we can do with it. So in developing the planned mixed use redrafting of that mixed use district, one of my goals was to develop something that basically sketched out some of the elements of a special use permit process that would involve approval of a concept plan. And I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it and then have everybody come back and say, no, that's all wrong. So I wanted to just sketch out some of the basic elements of what could go in it, with the idea that it would simply be a conversation starter to be able to begin the process of preparing various versions and discussing these versions, discussing pros and the cons of different parts of the application process, and how the village board approval of a special use permit for a concept plan would tie in with a site plan approval that was already envisioned as part of the MU1 district as a responsibility of the planning board. But it would rest within the village board some element of approval over the uses, the type of mix of uses, the sufficiency of certain things like transportation, traffic, but also covering things like fiscal impacts, because one of the specific recommendations within the comprehensive plan was that the development within this area would be tax positive for the village. And the way to be able to determine that is through a fiscal impact analysis. So I included those sorts of top level studies that would be done by the village board. And also because development like this, can't be done over once it's constructed, and because anything that happens in the village essentially is going to be a type 1 action under the seeker regulations, it seemed to make logical sense to make it a two-step seeker review process as well, to establish a requirement not only for the concept plan special use permit, but also for a generic environmental impact statement for the village board's approval of any kind of a concept plan on a site like Marathon. And there's different ways that you can go about undertaking a seeker review when it involves a two-stage process like this. The generic deals with broader issues, and it can include site-specific environmental analysis. So you can call something a generic environmental impact statement, but it can include components that also address the site-specific development on a particular property. And the decision is really, it's a decision that's more made by the applicant in a case like this, because what they're willing to do in the way of environmental analysis in order to get a decision from the village board can be done at a very conceptual stage, a very generic phase. And it can leave all of the site-specific details to be addressed under seeker to the planning board as part of the site plan review process. However, some of these things can also be done at the village board level, and that would lead to a situation where they need not be studied again as part of the planning board's site-specific review. So any sort of hard traffic studies and fiscal studies and that sort of thing, if they're done at the village board level, these are things that would not have to be addressed again at the planning board level. They might deal with stormwater runoff. They might deal with the aesthetics of the buildings and you know, a variety of other things. They may deal more closely with the, you know, whatever contamination is left on that site and how that's going to be dealt with. But it's a much more broad view of the seeker environmental impact assessment process by having the village board look at it on a more conceptual basis and then move on to the more specifics once it gets to the planning board for site plan approval. So that was the general idea for creating this. And I must say, you know, everybody's comments that came in were great. I thought they were all very pointed and thoughtful comments. And I think some of them do involve policy discussions. And so this is something that, you know, I would need direction from the village board in order to move forward with any additional, you know, redrafting of what you've already seen in the way of the first working draft that was developed. So I don't, does that answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, a couple of follow-ups on one of the parts or one of the procedures would be that it would also be referred to the planning board at the conceptual level from the village board. So
correct.
It's not like the village board is going to be there without professional guidance or without guidance from the planning board.
Yes, that's correct. That was built into it so that the planning board at the early stage, when it's in the conceptual phase and the sort of the sketch plan phase, that would give the planning board an opportunity to be able to weigh in and perhaps alert the village board because of their expertise through site planning and site plan approvals within the village. They could assist the village board in that regard. So that was something I tried to build into it too.
Okay, and then the other thing that we've talked about and I like and I think is very important is that there would be a public hearing, or so that, you know, for transparency and so that everyone knows before this goes to a site plan review that they would actually be able to see basically what's going there, a conceptual plan. So
correct.
I think that's one thing that would not happen during a if it was just an MU1 went to site plan. I mean, it would eventually go to a public hearing, but at a different stage.
Yes, and the one thing, you know, when you have a comprehensive plan, if you're adopting new zoning regulations or any kind of land use control, they have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. That doesn't mean that every policy statement, every recommendation of the comprehensive plan has to be followed to a T. And so one of the things which I did see in the comprehensive plan was for the mixed use developments that could potentially occur within the village and the mixed use properties, that they be subject to a special use permit. And when I looked at the MU1 for the planning board and their role in reviewing and approving a site plan for the site, I didn't see anything having to do with special permit. And that actually was how I got the idea of putting the village board in charge of the special permit. And then the planning, and that would deal with the use issues, compatibility with the village, compatibility with the neighborhood in which it's located. And then the planning board deals with more of the site-specific issues that they're much more familiar with. Even though I understand that the planning board is currently responsible for any other use within the village that requires a special use permit, it still does give the village board that overall authority to take a look at the uses and you know, how how well they meet the recommendations of the comprehensive plan.
And then at that stage, once the village board has reviewed, I'm sure the impact studies that we request are submitted, and we get a chance to, not me, whoever's sitting on the board would review those, would listen to public comment, receive the feedback and review what the planning board says, and make a decision. And then it would go to the planning board. And once it gets to the planning board and the site plan, then they basically would take over and it will be business as usual.
I would think, yes. I would think it would be much more the types of things that the planning board is familiar with dealing with, access and so forth.
Okay.
Landscaping, all the little details of the plan. That wouldn't necessarily be part of the concept plan. That would be the overall, the concept plan would be the overall direction that the developer of the site would want to move in. What's the mix of residential versus office versus retail? How would the street system be laid out? These are the bigger issues, I think, that have village-wide implications. And then once it gets to the planning board, then they can deal with the lighting issues and noise and landscaping and those sorts of things, which are traditionally part of the site plan review and approval process.
So one last one from me, then open up to the board also. As far as the secret review and determination for just the code change, not for the the application or moving forward. So is there a difference, or is it a positive deck either way we go? If we do an MU1 that's beefed up, seems like that has the same impacts as if we do a PMU1. And if so once we're reviewing those, or for the change, if we went either way, would the secret deck be different, or is one positive, one negative?
Well, Marie and I had a number of discussions about the secret review process for adoption of the zoning, and we had talked about the possibility of issuing a negative declaration if, after reviewing the entirety of Chapter 134 and the changes that were proposed to it from what the existing zoning says, we had talked about the possibility of issuance of a negative declaration if everything looked as if it were to be in accordance with the comprehensive plan, was following good planning, good environmental sorts of policies and practices, even though it is a type 1 action. Type 1 actions under seeker don't mandate the preparation of an environmental impact statement after issuance of a positive declaration. But when you have a type 1 action, by definition, they're more likely to require the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And that little clause was directly from the seeker regulations. It doesn't say you have to, but it says that it's more likely. And so there's always a discussion about this whenever any village, town, city is ready to make a change in zoning, and it's a type 1 action. There's always the question of whether or not there is sufficient justification within the seeker review process for adopting a negative declaration, which essentially says that there will be no significant adverse environmental impacts. That's basically what a negative declaration is a declaration that there will be no impacts. A positive declaration is that there may be one or more significant adverse impacts. But if everybody is in agreement that the zoning and the changes, and it's really the changes that are proposed to the zoning, if the village board is in agreement that it would not cause any significant adverse impacts, then the next step would be to prepare a negative declaration. And because it's a type 1 action, there are some additional responsibilities to do that. But so it's not a foregone conclusion. Now, with that said, the only other thing I was going to say, Dave, is with that said, the one of the issues with the positive declaration, of course, is the time element and the cost element. A positive declaration can easily take 6 months at the minimum. That's the minimum. I've never seen, an EIS go through much less than 6 months. And it's more typical because of scheduling and meeting and agendas and other concerns going on in the village. It's more likely to require a year or more to get through a positive declaration and an environmental impact statement process just on the adoption of the zoning. But once you've gone through that lengthier process, it's a much more secure approach to ensuring that if the village board were to be challenged on the adoption of the code changes for chapter 134, that you will have a more supportable decision. A negative declaration, if there is disagreement that adoption of the changes to chapter 134 could have some potential impact on the village or on the environment, not on an individual or anything like that, but broader sorts of concerns, and can convince a judge that you should have issued a positive declaration instead of a negative declaration, you're in a weaker position to argue, unless you can make a really compelling argument that the easier approach to adopt a negative declaration has a sufficient basis to be able to make that determination.
So it's the adverse effects. Would it be what the neg deck is actually saying is like if it's I1 and you're changing it to MU1, that like right now I1 and is it's what's approved, and so would it be the differences in that and the MU1 that would make the adverse effects? Because the same adverse effects might be there right now. I mean, if we're talking traffic, whatever, right now, if it's a, I1 might have the same as an MU1. So is that what the comparison would be, or would it be?
Yes. Yes, you would look at the comparison of what are the uses that would be permitted today in the I1 and what sorts of impacts would those uses have on village, traffic infrastructure and a whole variety of other things. And I think that would be important to reveal the differences in the uses, as well as the intensity of development that could occur under the old I1 versus if it were to be converted to an MU1 or a PMU1 or whatever. There has to be some way to be able to identify uses and then the intensity of use and all of the potential impacts. How much water would they use? How much sewer capacity they need? What would be the estimated traffic generation if it was an industrial facility, or if it was one of the other many, many uses that could be had within the I1 versus the MU1 district. So that's generally the way that those things work, is that you try and assess the differences. And if the MU1 would reveal that there would be less impact, less traffic, less demand on the water supply system, less demand on the sewage treatment plant, less demands on schools, for instance, or maybe the I1 would have less demand on schools. You have to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. And generally it's done through common standards that would allow you to be able to develop a matrix. And that matrix would identify, here are the uses that you could have in M1 or MU1, here are the uses that you could have in I1, and here's what the different impact categories would result in based upon standard factors that are in use by the planning and engineering professions.
Ted, have you been part of a positive declaration for a zone change?
Many.
Okay, are you able to provide the EIS that was put together for one of the projects you were working on, so that we can see what I'm having a difficult time imagining is at such a conceptual level, with lacking any actual project, how you are comparing impacts. I hear you saying using a table. I'd love to be able to see what that actually looks like in a review that was actually carried out?
Sure. And I've done it both ways, both with negative declarations and positive declarations. It depends on the scale. It depends on the degree of impact based upon the changes that are proposed. And I think there are common ways to be able to develop a set of assumptions and to apply those assumptions to standard factors that you can actually put numbers on. And they're all estimates. There has to be a lot of qualifications. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is what will happen there in the future. But based upon those assumptions, you're at least able to make some estimate of the differences between the two, the existing versus the proposed zoning change. The seeker handbook that's available by the New York State DEC, it was published last year. They have a very good discussion on the differences and how they can be identified for a generic review of a proposed zoning amendment. I think at the memo that I prepared, I can add that to some of the links that I had suggested for some reading, so you can get yourself up to speed on how these things work.
So just just so I'm clear on it, the MU1 or the PMU1, there would be the same, you do the same comparison. I mean, I think they're similar, or it's a mixed use, both of them. Is there any difference in the SECRA or how you would feel that would come out, whether it be a neg deck on one versus a pos on the other?
Well, I don't think that there is a big difference between the PMU1 or the PMU2 and the MU1, because essentially it's the process that changed by having the village board responsible for a special use permit and then moving on to the planning board. But the uses are still listed the same under the site plan, except that the village board would be given greater latitude to be able to take a look at the uses and may be in a position to impose certain conditions on how much. So for instance, we've talked about various percentages, that there should be a minimum percentage of residential versus office versus retail. And maybe the village board has, can use some of its greater authority as a legislative body to be able to take a look at that and say, well, based on the traffic, if you had 10% office rather than 15% office, then that reduces the traffic burden on village streets. So we would rather see 10% office rather than 15% office. If, for instance, that was to be a number that was to make it into this PMU district requirements, in terms of the standards.
And we could basically use the bulk standards that were in the MU1 and just shift them over to the PMU1 without any changes if we wanted to.
Yes, and that's really why I didn't do hardly anything with the existing site plan review and approval section that had already been established in the MU1. I left that pretty much the same that it was, except the one section was in the first one having to do with residential uses that it gave the village board greater latitude on the kinds of residential units that would be part of a concept plan.
And also, it's my understanding that if you say the size of the lots, if you had that, like if you made that right now, if it's 10,000, we made it 15,000 or made it higher, that during the planning board's, the site plan review, that they could, or during the review by the board, that they could, they could ask for that to be reduced, that size. It wouldn't mean that they necessarily had to build on that exact size if they could show how it would be more beneficial to the development.
Yes, that's correct. Because one of the features of a special use permit is that reasonable conditions can always be attached to the issuance of a special use permit.
Okay, thank you.
That's well founded.
So it sounds like or let me ask the question. If you were to determine a positive declaration, you're talking about an environmental impact statement in a very broad way regarding the site change, and then a generic environmental impact, I mean, it's also generic, but another generic environmental impact statement at conceptual phase, and then another environmental impact statement at the site plan phase.
Okay, well, first of all, if it were to be an environmental impact statement for the zoning, that is a much broader document that takes in the entire village, and all of the changes that are proposed as part of the code update process for the village zoning law. The generic environmental impact statement would be much more pertinent to a specific development on a specific site.
Right.
Only one site within the village.
And
that would be based upon the concept plan, okay? Doing the generic environmental review as part of the village board's seeker obligations would have to involve development of a series of assumptions. And then those assumptions would be used to develop what the impact thresholds or the impact categories are. And then there would be that, the assessment under seeker. You make reasonable conclusions about what the potential impacts are. You make reasonable conclusions about how the zoning as proposed is or is not consistent with the comprehensive plan. But there would be two very different types of seeker reviews done.
okay. And so when you're talking about a positive to date, the chapters that we have updated in the code have been negative declarations.
Correct.
What you're talking about now is the potential for identifying a positive declaration for 134, and then the whole of 134 is assessed for impact.
Correct. Correct. With seeker, you need in the issuance of positive declaration, there has to be at least one reason why the action has the potential to have a significant adverse impact. And if you do identify that as part of the environmental review process, then it makes a logical conclusion to go into the environmental impact statement process as opposed to simply using the full environmental assessment form. And typically, the way that this is done when you have a type 1 action is you prepare a part 1, a part 2. Most of the part 1 is not even applicable in a legislative decision like a zoning change. Part 2 is where, again, most of the categories are going to be no impact. With a decision like a adoption of zoning, the only things that really apply are what's going to be the impact on community character and what's going to be the impact on consistency with the comprehensive plan. Is there a change in uses such that that would lead to traffic problems if there was too much traffic? But you're not going to be addressing things like, well, what's the impact on land? But you're not proposing any changes. This is not a development decision, okay? This is a decision on the types of uses and the intensity of uses that would be enabled by making that zoning change. So there are a very limited number of impact categories that you would be addressing with as part of the zoning amendment process. And then once you've assessed and filled out the Part 2 EAF form, and there are, in excess of 100 questions on the Part 2 EAF form, once you've filled that out, if any of those questions would lead to an answer that would be considered a potentially large impact, then the next step in the process would be to have a narrative discussion of what is the impact? Can the impact be mitigated by a project change? What is the importance of that impact? What's the scale and magnitude of it? How many people are affected by it? So there's a lot of other questions that go into the discussion of potential changes when they're proposed as part of a new zoning regulation.
Ted, Wally, I've looked at your PMU and I've looked at Marie's MU1, and I'm looking at timelines. And as you know, Dave and Marie and I are off the board in 6 weeks, and one of those weeks is Thanksgiving, so really 5 weeks. And my concern is that the code update that we have a grant for, which is pretty much expiring, gets completed. So my thoughts today, and I threw this out to the board, I'm not sure how many were happy or not happy with this, were that we, as some people have said, kick this down the road. Changing the marathon and going through all this, realistically, how long would it take us to get the I-1 marathon property changed to an MU1 or a PMU2 and get it done, get it finished, get a resolution, get a local law done so that we can say that 134 is complete? And would it make more sense at this point in our term to pass this, leave it as an I-1, which it has been for years and years and years, complete the 134, complete what we've done for the code update, and then the next board can very easily open this up. It's not like we're going to lock it in forever and ever. They can open it up and continue the work that we've started here. Does that make sense? And does it sound like something that we could accomplish?
You mean before?
Before we're
terms.
out. Yes, which would be like the end of November, technically.
Right. Well, we're at October 21st. I think the end of your terms are December 6th, is it?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The one caution that I would bring to this is, and you know, in response to your question, Fran, zoning can often take time, as you well know. It's taken quite a long time for the Code Update Committee to come through and present their recommendations to the village board. And depending upon the complexity of what you're trying to change now at the 11th hour, basically, is really dictated by how well all the pieces can come together. And whether or not you feel that we can go through perhaps a series of iterations on the zoning to make sure that you get it right and have these things adopted, and how often you're willing to meet in the next few weeks. And really, there's only how many weeks? 5, 6 weeks left. Yeah, so it does really, the timing does get critical. And I think we probably should have John involved in this discussion, because zoning, there's a specific number of measurable steps that have to be taken in any zoning change. Seeker is only one of them. There's notification to surrounding municipalities. There's, you know, continuing with public hearings and so on. And so I think, you know, I don't want to pass the buck to John necessarily, but I do think that having the village attorney involved in the discussion of whether or not this thing could be timed out before December 6th is critical to the discussion. And I would certainly feel more comfortable if John was a part of that, because I think we need to really go and back up from December 6th and see whether or not all those steps that need to be taken can be taken in that period of time. The NYSERDA grant is a different story. You know, they have to understand that the village has a responsibility to ensure that it takes a hard look at any land use changes, that land use control changes, and that includes zoning. And so I think they understand that if there was a delay because the village board determines that an EIS was necessary, that I'm sure that they would grant additional time to do that. It's a state law that has to be complied with. And you're now just holding public hearings on this thing, but yet you still have that one responsibility to make sure that seeker is addressed, that you've done a hard look, and that you make a supportable decision at the end of the day, so that if it were to be challenged by any one or more parties within the village, that you can defend yourselves against a challenge that could potentially throw the whole thing out. And I don't think you want that after all the years of work that you put into it.
Now, are you saying that that challenge could happen whether we go back and leave it unchanged for the time being and let the next board open up and continue this process, or would it only happen if we move on and make some changes? I mean, what I see is like a number of things. In my mind, and this may be totally wrong, we could leave this property as an I-1 and hopefully close this public hearing and get 134 done and the last 3 chapters that we need to get done. We could struggle to try to get this change through and do the best we can with it. We could leave this part of the code update open for the next board to complete the 134 and the last 2 chapters that are connected with it, and let the next board finish this up, in which case this the zoning chapter would not be done by us, which is fine by me, and as long as it gets done. So am I missing something?
No, but I just don't know how you can predict whether someone will come in and challenge the zoning. They could do it whether or not you make any changes or not. There could be something completely unrelated to this that could have, could be impacted by a challenge. I've seen these things come in, without any warning. The village would have to defend itself, unless you were, I just think that that's really something that you can't speculate on now, but you do have to protect yourself and make sure that you do everything in accordance with the seeker procedures and all of the other village law procedures in terms of the amendments to the zoning that are being proposed. And I think that's first and foremost, your responsibility to do that. And if somebody's going to challenge it, they're just going to challenge it. But you want to be prepared for that, regardless of whatever direction this takes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Trustee Woods, any?
I guess my question is, I mean, the challenge aspect has been an issue from the beginning, no? I mean, once you open up looking at the zoning and looking at changing things, at any point, somebody could have challenged what we were proposing. Isn't that correct? That's a question for you, Ted.
Oh, you're asking me?
Yes.
Yes, from day one. Anytime you make a change to the zoning, there's always a potential that someone is going to challenge it if they don't like what you're proposing to do. So that remains, regardless of what course you decide to take here, whether it's I-1, MU1, or PMU.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm still formulating.
So I'm wondering what it is about this particular proposed change, which has been under discussion by the CUC, by the previous iteration of the board. We've been talking about 134 modifications that include the creation of new zones, right? PR1 on the waterfront. What is it about this change that is causing concern and alarm that has not been expressed in other proposals? For example, the waterfront I-1 change to PR1. I understand that we're talking about a different intensity of uses, but if you're laying this out as any change can spark challenge, why was this not a concern in other portions of the discussion of 134? I don't recall this level of anxiety and fear.
I can speak for myself. I mean, I think what Ted was just saying is really important. First of all, anyone can sue at any time for anything. I mean, that's just a given. They can.
Sure.
And it's been done. this property is, I believe it's close to 12 acres, or if not more. It's in a residential area that's been established. There are several, there's access issues that have to be looked at. There's environmental issues. This piece of property and the development of this piece of property, I think, is an incredibly important thing to do properly and not to be rushed. And why it wasn't flagged before, or why there was an intense study of it before, I can't say. I'm surprised I didn't flag it right away until we got to this point. But I think we're here now, and I think what we're supposed to do as elected officials, I think we're supposed to be working for the residents of the whole village that we represent, and I think we need to do the right thing. And as Ted said before, I don't think we want to get down the road and find out that all of this work is just thrown out because we didn't do our due diligence. So regardless of how we got here or why it wasn't, there wasn't the level of intense concern before, I don't think that is more important than where we are right now and what we should do and how we should proceed. And I think it's our responsibility to do the right thing. I think we're following the comprehensive plan, just as Ted said, and maybe even following it better than before, with added controls on it. And so I think we're doing everything right by looking at this and changing it. I think everyone's in agreement to go to a mixed use. I don't think there's any, there hasn't been anything that I've heard from anyone that said otherwise. Again, we're where we are now, and I think we need to do this right. It's like the last huge piece of property in the village, and it's very important to all the residents around. I think there's 170 properties there, so that'll be affected by this, and that's 300 or so people if you just say 2 per property. So I think it's incumbent on us to do the right thing right now, and so that's why I think there is concern. That's why I'm concerned, and I want to make sure we do it right.
Understood. And if the waterfront had not shifted in the last session to I-1 and PR1, a combined district, which at some point I want to understand more from Ted about, would you have anticipated the same process? We didn't have this discussion when the waterfront was proposed as in the shift.
The one that was recently through, I think it was Donald McDonald's comments that was brought to everyone's attention.
Yeah, the marathon.
Marie's spreadsheet brought that to our attention.
It's the village property that goes from the highway garage to the Putnam County properties, which had been always I-1. Kathleen, when you say waterfront, as it turns out, there's waterfront park. So this is different.
I'm sorry. I am specifically referring to the highway department, the municipal blot, the water and sewer, Mayor's Park, and the underwater parcels owned by Putnam County.
So originally they were all zoned I-1. When we began the discussion, what the proposal was to change everything that was I-1 to MU1.
Right.
And then we voted to say, no, let's go back to I-1. So we went back to I-1. There was a concern that the village-owned property should not be I-1, it should be PR1, although I think we would agree that it has industrial uses on it. So it seemed, and that's what I proposed last week, and everyone agreed to, that it become an I-1 and PR1, which is not uncommon. The previous district map showed at least one other property that was zoned 2 different districts. And I don't think there's, and I haven't heard anyone say that the water treatment plant shouldn't be I-1.
Oh, no question. I mean, it's also not going anywhere. I think
if I may jump in,
go ahead, Fran.
I think what we're getting here is the residents who live around the Marathon property are the ones who are very much affected by our decisions here. Mayor's Park property and the Highway Garage property is not affecting residents the way this Marathon property decision is. And so therefore you're going to have a bunch of residents who are very concerned about.
Understood, as modified, right.
And that's why we're getting, that's why we're getting this, you know, this conversation and back and forth. And the Mayor's Park property wasn't going to get that kind of, I mean, granted, people wanted it to stay as a PR, but
well, if it had stayed as MU, it would have, sure.
I think a huge distinction is that the Marathon site is privately owned and the property we're discussing along the riverfront is owned by the village.
Sure.
Ted, do you have any thoughts on, I think some people might need a little clarity on having two zones in one piece of parcel. I'm not sure if you were familiar with this discussion, but the section has there's the highway department and the water treatment plant, and then there's the Mayor's Park. What was proposed is to have both the PR or the parks designation and the industrial on that one piece of property. Are you familiar with that, or could you speak to that?
I'm really not familiar with that, and I haven't been a part of these discussions, so this is all new to me. I was looking at the map, and that did show the MU1 for that entire area, just west of Fair Street. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't even aware that there were discussions about changing it back to the I1 or the PR designation. If they're all these, now you're saying that every one of these properties is owned by the village?
It's one
or are municipally owned?
It's one parcel. It's not multiple parcels. It's one parcel. It's about 8 acres.
Okay.
And there was Donald McDonald had suggested to protect the parks that we have two zones in one for the property. So are you familiar with two designations in one piece of property?
Yes. Yes, that's not unusual in general. It's a good practice to try and have each parcel have its own rather than have it split by 2 or more zoning districts. It does, it can create some complications, but I do see it frequently. It's something that does happen. So it's not out of the ordinary.
I imagine that you would need, in the case where you have 2 on a parcel, which we have had previously, understanding that a stated goal of the CUC was to try to get away from that as much as possible. And then of course, going down the road, that's going to change again. But you would seem that you would need to have clear guidance in the zoning code for how the ZBA would deal with applications on a parcel that had 2 zones, how they would interpret the application of the 2. Which set of standards would they be working from if there are 2 designations on the parcel? We're not talking about the subdivision. It's not subdivided, right? We're talking about a single parcel with 2 zones right now.
Correct.
The ideal solution is to have it surveyed and subdivided into a northern portion and a southern portion. That would be the ideal solution.
But until that is done, you have a lack of clarity for the zoning board for reviewing. Not that there's a rush for any application at that location, but they would need to have some guidance on how to interpret.
In general, when the zoning board is faced with 2 different criteria, the most restrictive applies. And in the case of I1 and PR1, the most restrictive is I1.
Mm-hmm. So that's another, it sounds as if that's evolving to another down the road project to return to, is the subdivision and proper identification of the Mayor's Park and Pavilion area for proper protection as PR1, and then the appropriate zoning of the balance of the parcel, which is sewer, highway, municipal lot.
Well, as it turns out, as I said, the most restrictive zoning applies, and that's I1. So it seems to me that PR1, the area that the attempt to apply PR1 to any portion of that parcel, you should apply I1 to that parcel. which is the 44,000 square feet for any subdivision or any.
If your goal is preserving the park, I would think that you would want the park portion to be designated Parks and Rec.
Do that.
That's what I'm saying, Marie. I'm saying that that's something that will also need to be returned to.
You and I had that discussion at least a month ago. The optimum solution is to subdivide, survey, subdivide.
Yeah, I'm stating it for the public record since we had that discussion Tuesday evening and it was not clear.
What wasn't clear?
How the village property on the waterfront along Fair Street is being addressed and what position that leaves the park in. So the answer is there is more work to be done post the decision we made the other night.
Okay, we made the decision the other night. Yes.
And so in future, at some point, there will need to be a subdivision and a proper identification of the Mayor's Park area as the park area.
If the future board determines that's what they want to do.
Okay.
And if the public wants the park protected.
Can we, since Ted is here and we'd love to use his professional knowledge.
I wanted his professional knowledge on that parcel as well.
Okay, but he's not familiar with that parcel.
Clearly.
Stated, so it would be hard to get his feedback on it right now, I think. So if we could get back to the other, the marathon site, has everyone had their questions answered, or are you more clear or need more clarity on a PMU2 versus, or anything? Leaving it as light industrial, questions on SECRA?
I have just kind of a question of process at this point. So Fran, it sounds to me like Fran and Dave are suggesting that we just sort of put this to bed for the moment, just leave it as is, and then leave the decisions to continue and work on this for the next iteration of the board. Is that process-wise, is that what you're saying? And if that is the case, what does that mean in terms of decisions that will be left open for the next board?
Entire chapter 134, basically.
Not the entire chapter. No. It's one section of 134. It's one section of 76, and it's, I think, two statements in 104.
And I think the process, from what I got from Ted before, will be the same whether we change it or whether we let this stay as is. And because I don't believe, from what I understood from Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, even if we don't make any changes, we still have to go through probably more than 5 or 6 weeks worth of legal things to get 134 finished. Is that correct?
Well, that's where I think you need advice from John to make sure that all of the steps that are required for a zoning change are in place and ready to go. The SECRA review process, if it were to be done as far as a negative declaration, that's not anywhere near as big a deal as it would be if we went into an EIS. That would unquestionably take you into next year.
Okay, so yes.
There's no way around that.
So
but
why
a negative?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say a negative declaration, though, if assuming that all of the zoning steps that are required for adopting zoning are in place, I think the SECRA could be done in a timely manner. There's no requirement that you have a public hearing on SECRA negative declaration. The assumption here is that there is a finding within your negative declaration document that basically here are the reasons that support the issuance of negative declaration. And there needs to be a very well-written section that outlines exactly why the negative declaration is an appropriate document to adopt, because there is the following analysis that has led to the following conclusions. And on that basis, the village board is comfortable saying that there The action of adopting Chapter 134 will not result in any significant adverse impacts.
So Ted, I see that 3 different paths. Leave I-1 in, make no changes to I-1. The second is to go back to the MU1 definition with some additional safeguards or guardrails. And the third is to go with a conceptual plan, the PMU2. Those, I think, are the 3 paths in front of us. Would you agree?
Well, yes, I think that's basically what you have in front of you. And just for clarification purposes, the PMU, the reason I used a 2 in there was because when I looked at this, and the map that I'm looking at, it says preliminary 2021 Cold Spring zoning. It does show that entire area west of Fair Street. And I think there's 6 parcels in what shows up as an MU1 district. So I was not aware that there were changes that were made to the zoning designations that were recommended for that area. And I was focused on the Marathon as being the area that was designated MU1. And so to preserve the MU1 up there, which I don't think was on the table for having this concept plan approval process, that's why I put in the 2 after the PMU for planned mixed use, but it would apply to the second area within the village that was designated for MU1. So I now know that that's changed though from your discussion tonight.
Yeah. So
okay.
if we stay with I-1 as it has been for 15 years, let me say off the top of my head, the discussion that you and I had was that would probably, so we would then just be evaluating the other changes in 134, such as the definition of basement. How do you measure basement? How do you measure height of a building? Topics like that, definition changes. That would, and the conversation that you and I had is that would probably result in a neg deck.
That's correct.
Okay. If we go with MU1, which I think you had seen, but not necessarily the MU1 on steroids that John had described a week or so ago, which has more guardrails on it, that is more similar to what the MU1 looked like that you had seen. So it was a mixed use development with the specific uses identified. Bulk requirements were in there. And it required as the first step a site plan review by the Board of Trustees. The difference between that and the MU1 on steroids is that it included a PUD description as the first step before going on to a site plan review. And the PUD description was at the approval of the Village Board of Trustees, and it would require a public hearing. So it's a process change as opposed to a content change, similar to the conceptual plan recommendation or the conceptual plan description that you had provided. If you go back to the MU1 that we had discussed a few months ago, would you think that, and I think our discussions had been that would probably not result in a positive declaration, that it would still be a negative declaration. Is that correct?
The original, well, the one that I have and that I have been relying on is dated, I think it's August 30th. Is that the correct one?
Who sent that to you? Do you remember?
No, I looked at the metadata on the file and it was dated August 30th.
I don't remember, and I'm not at my desktop, so I can't look it up.
Okay, so that's the one, that's the version that I've seen. If there is another one that was subsequent to the August 30th, the one that you said was on steroids, I have not seen that.
Okay, I can get that to you tonight.
Okay.
Not now, but later tonight. The third path is the conceptual plan path. in your opinion, would that result in a positive or a negative declaration?
Well, not necessarily, because I think the uses and the bulk requirements stay essentially the same as they would have in the MU1, as I had reviewed it based on that August 30th version.
There was one change in the uses. The August 30th version said any use allowable in an R1 district. Turns out there are a lot of uses allowable in an R1 district, including churches. What else? I think hospitals, and we would not include those in the description, either in MU1 or in the conceptual plan uses. So there's been a winnowing down, if you will, of residential uses in the conceptual. I would recommend a winnowing down of the conception of residential uses in the conceptual plan, and adding more prohibited uses in the conceptual plan, such as short-term rentals, such as accessory apartments. So given your current description of the conceptual plan approach, do you think that would result in a positive or negative declaration?
Well, I think the analysis has to be done first. As I said before, you're looking at a comparison of the I1, which is your current zoning on the site, and then you're comparing that with the MU1 and the bulk requirements, making certain assumptions. That analysis has not been done yet, and until that's done, it's very difficult to speculate and say, positively that it would result in the pos deck versus the neg deck. And I think I'd like to have the opportunity to be able to take a look at and compare those two sections. The most current version of the MU1 and use that in comparison to the I1 to be able to draw some conclusions on that.
Okay. How long would it take for you to come up with an estimate of whether it's going to require, whether or not it can be a neg or a positive declaration for either MU1 or the conceptual plan?
Well, I would say that it would probably take me a couple of days to put it all together.
Okay.
Also, on the way I see the difference in the MU1 as it was written and the PMU1 or 2, sorry, I don't see any difference in the standards. I see the difference in a different stage. I don't see there being any difference. I don't think of what's going to be allowed in either. I think both of those will be the same. I don't see any difference.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Dave, because I think it's primarily a process issue that retains some authority of the village board to have control over the ultimate development that occurs within that area, and that the rest is virtually the same.
So MU1 on steroids includes that as well.
Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about that. Has Ted seen Marie's proposed?
No, we just
so he's at a disadvantage right now as well.
Right, but as I said, the difference in process is that the first step is a PUD. You need to go through the PUD steps and have the village board would approve it, and there must be a public hearing. So it's similar in terms of the level of review, both external to the village board, as well as who gets the final sign off on it. It's the same.
In which two things are you talking about right now?
MU1 V2 and PMU2.
The MU1, the revised version that you put forward.
Yeah, on Tuesday.
And Ted's version put forward.
Yep.
The same day.
Yep. The head is moving in agreement.
So I'm looking at you are saying that the village board piece is in your draft as well?
Yes, it should be in. I'm at a disadvantage as everyone else is. I don't have it in front of me, but it should be right above site plan.
So is there a subsequent version?
I sent out 2 versions on Tuesday. In fact, I begged off of with my conference call with you to send out the 2nd version. So it was after that, probably around 2 or 3 in the afternoon.
I see it.
Doesn't a PUD, is that actually what you're calling it? Because isn't a PUD something that the developer would have to actually ask for? And if it was an MU1, would they have to ask for it, or would they be able to, comply with code and build per code? Why PUD is being mentioned.
So the idea was that that whatever materials are typically required for a PUD would be required as the first step. Thank you. I'm no longer at a disadvantage. Would be required as the first step for MU2, PMU1.
And what are the objections to the PMU1?
I don't necessarily have an objection. I'm trying to make sure that I'm tracking the right documents.
I'm asking, and not necessarily you, but the whole board. Is there an objection to the PMU and why we're designing our own?
Well, we had always designed our own, so it's not that we're doing it new. And our conversation with Ted and John on Friday, I mentioned, can we put more safeguards in MU1 to make it more acceptable? And in terms of objections,
at the same time, we're having a discussion on a different way to do that, which has been vetted by our consultant, who and has sent us basically what that would look like. So I'm not sure why. I guess if we're designing something else, it seems like you wouldn't there's something about that plan that you don't like or that's not acceptable.
So I'll throw one thing out: fiscal impact. Why would we have the developer go through a fiscal impact analysis? I can see how much the developer pays today in property taxes on the 24 lots. I assume that once development begins on any single parcel, the assessed valuation is going to go up. And so it will have a positive tax impact on the village.
Isn't that also related to how many children may be in a development and how that'll affect our school system?
So the question was positive impact on the village taxes. Period. That was the question, and that's my response. Any development there will have a positive impact on the village's taxes.
I don't know if it's just taxes. Is it the impact on how it will affect schools or everything in general?
Yeah. Schools would be an essential part of any sort of a fiscal analysis. It would look at all taxing jurisdictions. It would look at any county taxes, any school taxes, village taxes. So that would be integral to a fiscal impact analysis. They generally follow standard procedures. There is probably the foremost publication on this is the Fiscal Impact Handbook that was developed by Bob Burchell and David Listikin with Rutgers Center for Urban Policy Research. They maintain up-to-date factors that are used in the analysis of fiscal impact, and essentially it's a numbers analysis that looks at the various land uses that are proposed. Residential normally results in tax negative implications. In other words,
to the school district.
To the school district.
Yes,
exactly. That is there are cost of community services studies that have been done nationwide, and virtually all of them, unless it's very, very high-end single-family housing, will be tax negative. And that's simply because each new school child that's generated by every new house is going to cost that school district another $15,000. And you get to a certain level, and then you need new school buildings, and that's capital costs that also have to be factored into it. So there's a standard and well accepted in the economic and the planning community with fiscal impact analysis. And because of that recommendation in the comprehensive plan, that it promotes economic health through positive tax impact and economic activity, that would be one of the factors that would be drawn in on any sort of a fiscal impact analysis.
And so what you would do to address that is to limit the amount of residential space and increase the amount of commercial, retail, light industry space.
Well, that would be one of the options that would need to be discussed, and that's at the conceptual level, which is why I included it as part of the concept plan approval that the village board would undertake. So at a broader level.
So Dave, you asked if there are any problems. Yes, I think a fiscal impact analysis. I don't think the village has required something like that on any other development that I'm aware of.
Is this, I mean, how many 12-acre lots have we developed, and why wouldn't we do that? If it doesn't sound like it's going to take forever or cost huge amounts of money, and it's in the comprehensive plan. So why wouldn't we do that?
The comprehensive plan is relative to the village of Cold Spring, not to the Haldane Central School District.
But the impact of this will impact us.
Potentially.
Oh, well,
potentially.
Yes, potentially, and that's why we do studies.
Yes, but Ted, one of my questions to you is, how long would it take a developer to address all of the elements of the conceptual plan process from start to finish?
I don't know how I would even begin to answer that, because it depends on the developer, and it depends on the advice that they're given by consultants to the developer. Typically, to get through a generic environmental impact statement process, just as if the village were to go through that environmental impact statement process on the zoning, you're looking at 6 months to a year to get through an EIS process.
Okay.
That's built into the seeker regulations. There are minimum time periods. There's minimum responsibilities of documentation and administration and everything else, and public input that has to be factored into the analysis. And lots of things can get in the way when these processes start to unfold, and there's often sticky issues that sometimes require that the minimum timeframes be extended out, and so I've seen these processes go on months, years, until the issues are worked out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to get a handle on that. Yeah.
So the second, as I said to you in my email, my two concerns are the lack of criteria that would be applied in the evaluation of the conceptual plan by the village board. That was one concern. There doesn't seem to be anything specific or concrete, if you will, that would lead the village board to say, oh, this is a good street plan layout versus this is a bad street plan layout, just as an example. The second primary concern that I had, that I articulated to you, is I don't understand, once something is approved by the village board, how subsequent changes to the concepts that were approved by the village board, how subsequent changes are dealt with. Who hears the requirements from the property owner that instead of having a, bear with me, a 100,000 square foot structure, I'm joking on that one, and instead they want to make it a 110,000 square foot structure. Who hears that request? Who gets to say yes or no?
Yeah, there is an interplay that would have to happen between the village board and the planning board. If the village board based its issuance of the special use permit on a specific set of circumstances and facts that the developer has presented to them, that there will be X number of residential units, there will be X amount of square footage of office, there will be X number of retail facilities, and this is the way it's going to be laid out on a plan, and this is how we're going to accommodate traffic, and this is how we're going to accommodate, you know, X, Y, and Z. They get to the planning board level and things change. Now the developer wants to change the mix of the number of residential units, or you know, that's a significant change, because the village board is basing its decision of the special use permit on a certain set of facts that have been studied through a generic environmental impact statement. Does that mean that they have to come back to the village board for an amended special use permit? It depends on how different it is, but if there is what appears to be a significant change, then I believe that they would probably have to come back for an amended special use permit.
Okay, let me take it a step further and say that in my example to you, let's say there are 2 properties identified on the site which are to be determined, what their use, what the structure size, or what the square footage is, which is one of the requirements in the conceptual plan. Once that structure is built, the owner of that property, who does the owner of the property come to ask for an extension to that house? They want to put an addition on their house. The addition may or may not conform to the bulk requirements.
So
well,
Ted, if could you correct me if I'm wrong? If once it goes from the concept plan, I don't, can the site plan vary much from that? And if there's, you know, bulk requirements or whatever, and can they vary much from that? And once a site plan is you know, given to the planning board, and the planning board goes to that and changes that, or I mean works with that and then approves that, I would think regardless of whatever happened after that would be under our code enforcement, because planning board has approved it. So, you know, in this situation, if the planning board and the site plan comes to the planning board and they say X can go on this piece of property, this X can go here, and then they approve it to that, they can't change that, and it would come back to our code at that point. I mean our code enforcement.
That's correct. And if they needed an area variance, they would have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. I don't think that there was any difference from any other development within the village that would have to go through the same process to satisfy the requirements of the village code.
So, and that was one of my questions to you, and I thank you very much for the answer. What happens if bear with me. Oh, I've lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. It's gone. It's gone now. Oh, I'm back to it now. Part of the conceptual plan, which was either stated or implied, is that the village board can change the bulk requirements. They have the discretion to change the bulk requirements as part of the conceptual planning process. At what point do at any point do the changed bulk requirements get put into the code, or do they just apply to the conceptual plan, or must they be adhered to by the site plan, and must they be adhered to by the code enforcement officer? This is on the premise that the village board can change the bulk requirements or change the percentage of use.
Well, we haven't really gotten to the point of talking about the specifics of the MU1. At this point, I focused on the process to have a more inclusive process involving the village board. I think that's a good question, Marie, as far as how the bulk requirements would be treated. I think it's something that's worthy of additional discussion to make sure that, that we get that part of it right. We weren't there yet because, as I said, I took the existing provisions that had been developed for the MU1 and simply went with them at this point, focusing instead on developing a way to be able to have a process that involved the village board without the necessity of a zoning change for the property, as we had talked about at one time with a floating zone or with a planned unit development zone.
Right.
So I think that's something that I'd like to get a little bit of thought to before simply, throwing out an answer, and maybe get back to you on that one, and maybe talk about it with John as well to see if we could weave in something that would provide the kinds of flexibility that I think the whole concept of a planned mixed-use district is developed around, because we had talked about the planned unit development process and some of the characteristics of planned unit development, which is really to take a property and to come up with the best possible and the most flexible way to be able to develop that property based upon a whole mix of different uses that you and I can't envision at this point, but perhaps somebody else has a vision for how they'd like to develop the property in the future. And so I think there are certainly ways to be able to come up with the proper language to allow that sort of thing to happen. I'm not sure it's there now with the way that the current MU1 has been prepared.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
My concern, of course, is that if the village board has the opportunity and the ability to modify bulk requirements during the conceptual plan review, do those changed bulk requirements get memorialized in the zoning?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah.
Okay, so it's almost 9 o'clock. I had talked to John today. He is available next Tuesday or Wednesday, but I think Tuesday we have, I forget, what are we doing? Tuesday's the audit.
Yeah, the audit.
So that's probably not a good night. Ted, would you be available next week on Wednesday, perhaps?
On Wednesday, unfortunately, I'm going to be on a boat Wednesday evening.
That doesn't sound unfortunate.
Well, it's a ferry. It's not sexy. I'll be in my car sitting in a boat. So unfortunately, I'm going to have a ferry around 7 o'clock.
Is Monday a possibility?
Yeah, let me just check. I think Monday is a possibility. Let me just check and make sure. Yes, I'm available Monday, the 25th.
I'd have to check with John, but how does the board want to move forward with this? I'd like to keep it going. If Tuesday's not good and Wednesday's not good, and we keep pushing it out, can we meet on Monday? Is everyone okay with that? Is that too soon, or would you rather just wait till Ted's available again and have Ted and John on the line?
I thought that John said he is not available until Tuesday. I'm just pulling up the email.
That might be true. I think he did say Tuesday, Monday.
Can we start early on Tuesday? I mean, we have a 6:30 audit. Can we start at 6 o'clock or 5:30?
Are you available on Tuesday, Ted?
Oh, I have a workshop meeting that night. Yeah, starting at 7 o'clock. I have to be in Monroe that night.
And Thursday, are you still on your boat?
Nope. I won't be on a boat on Thursday. I'm available Thursday night.
Okay, I will try to get John for Thursday night. Sounds like the next closest date, if that's good with everyone else.
No, Dave, I can't.
What time would you like to start, or what time's good for you, Ted?
I'm free on Thursday, so I could start anytime. So work around me on Thursday night.
Dave, I can't make it Thursday night.
Okay. All right. All right. That leaves nothing. I mean, that leaves Friday, which is not good. And then I'm not sure what we're getting into. So, okay, let me look at the calendar.
Day?
Yes.
Can we start earlier Thursday, Maria? Are you good earlier on Thursday, like 3 or 4 o'clock? No?
I'm
okay.
working
Okay.
from 2:30 to 9.
Okay.
I would suggest too that this is a topic of significant public interest, and we should try to keep to standard meeting times when the public's available to listen.
Well, since they're on Zoom and we would like to move this forward, if it wasn't on Zoom and people.
Well, but people work. people work. And I think starting a discussion of a topic like this
Okay,
at 5 o'clock
we-
in an evening is not a good idea.
Okay.
I hear
Monday.
you. I hear your concerns. I would think that if it was on Zoom and people were interested and they can follow it on Zoom and we weren't making decisions, which we won't be, that I'm fine with that.
I can do Monday the 1st.
Well, before you go on,
Mhm.
I think Tuesday is good for everybody except for me. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Can I get back? Is it possible for me to get back to you? Because you already have a meeting scheduled for Tuesday, so you don't have to do any special arrangements for that night, correct?
Correct.
Right. We'd have to notice it earlier, an early start.
Okay. Can I get back to you on that to
Yes.
see whether or not I might be able to become available Tuesday night?
That'd be great. Jeff, does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay. You can call either of us, Ted, and let us know, and then we will get it to the board.
Okay. I'll call you first thing tomorrow morning.
Perfect.
And let you know.
Okay. So with that, we'll continue we'll leave the public hearing open. Hopefully the next meeting tentatively will be set for Tuesday at 6, I guess, if we can do that. We'll see when Ted's available. We'll have to notice it tomorrow. We'll notice it tomorrow. I'll call everyone.
And that would be to have an earlier start for Tuesday night?
Yeah, because then
Okay.
our other's already scheduled with our auditor. So that'd be
Okay.
good.
Sure.
Is it
Okay. Not a problem.
realistic? Is it realistic that only a half hour is needed?
Okay, is it starting at 6:30? Okay, well, what would be the earliest time you could make, Ted? Or could you make 5?
Yeah, I could make 5. Actually, the earlier the better.
Okay.
Alternatively, what if we start at 7:30 with Ted?
So that it's
It's
the
a
later
meeting.
discussion.
Well, no.
We do
Ted
the
has
audit first.
My problem Tuesday, if I'm available, I'd be available anytime. If I have to go to my other meeting, that starts at 7 o'clock.
Gotcha.
And typically goes from 7 to 9 o'clock. It's a planning board meeting.
Got it.
But if I can, if you could have an early start to the meeting, 5:30, something like that, then that would allow me the time to be able to devote to the other commitment.
Okay. So let us know, and then we will.
But I'll let you know first thing tomorrow.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Right. With that, I think it's 9:04. I would like to make a motion to adjourn.
Are you not taking
No,
any
I'm not going to take public
No,
tonight.
not tonight.
So I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all. Thank you, Ted. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Okay, you're welcome. Good night.
Good night.
Night.